Guys, welcome back for section 3 of chapter 7. Today we are going to finish up talking about a couple different types of market structures, and then we'll have just one section to finish up for this unit before your quiz. So what we're going to look at today is monopolistic competition. And we'll talk about how firms can compete without lowering price. There are other ways that firms can be competitive with one another. And then we'll talk about what an oligopoly is as well, and that's going to be our last type of market structure. So some key terms here for this section. We have monopolistic competition, the market structure where many companies sell products that are similar but not identical. There's some level of differentiation, which is when basically the characteristics that make a product different from other similar products. We'll talk about non-price competition. So this would be a way we can attract customers through different styles or level of service or location, rather than simply competing through who has the lowest price. We have oligopolies, which is a market structure where we have a few large firms that dominate a market. So it's not like a monopoly where there's just one, but there's just a few different firms that dominate the market in that particular industry. So then we have price wars, which are a series of competitive price cuts that lower the market price actually below the cost of production. So firms would lose money in most price wars. Collusion is an illegal agreement among firms to divide up the market, to set prices, or to limit production in some way. So they're kind of meeting together and making agreements that may be mutually beneficial as a firm or for all firms, but that may not be the best thing for consumers. Likewise, price fixing is an agreement among firms to charge one price for the same good. And then a cartel is a formal organization of producers that agree to coordinate prices and production. So we probably think of the term cartel as being associated with most illegal goods, but there are cartels that are formed within legal industries as well. So what are some characteristics of monopolistic competition and oligopolies? That's what we're going to be looking at today. So far we have talked about monopolies and perfect competition. And we do have some examples of both in like modern society and economics, but I would argue that we see a lot more monopolistic competition and even oligopolies within our economy. So in monopolistic competition, many companies compete in an open market to sell similar but not identical products. And so like some common examples of monopolistic competitive firms would be like the market for jeans, right? Jeans are pretty much like the same product, a similar product, but you can get jeans that are light wash or dark wash or skinny jeans or bell bottoms, or they have rips in them or they do not, or you like a particular brand name or just prefer generic, right? There are so many different versions of jeans. And so while they're a similar product, there are things that differentiate them from their competitors. Likewise, you have monopolistic competition with like bagel shops and gas stations, retail stores in general, really, are going to fit the bill for monopolistic competition. So this is just kind of an example of monopolistic competition. So we talked about bagel shops or coffee shops. So Dunkin' Donuts, for example, provides donuts and coffee in the beverage industry. And Dunkin' Donuts was founded in 1950 and was the #1 retailer of hot and iced regular coffee by the cup in the United States. In the beverage industry, we can see that there are quite a number of companies that operate within the same industry as Dunkin' Donuts and offer a similar product. So we have Starbucks and Krispy Kreme for donuts, and Caribou Coffee and Dunn Brothers and Beans Coffee, right? But each of these companies has their own characteristic that differentiate them with their competitors. So Krispy Kreme is more concentrated on the production of donuts, while Starbucks is big in providing like various blended coffees. Dunkin' Donuts likewise has its own characteristic, which really their focus is on regular coffee, with an available selection of different types of donuts or cakes. And so these firms are going to compete most of the time through non-price competition, right? Like, for example, say Dunkin' Donuts is doing very well, like we'll say out on the East Coast, right? Super popular, but they're competing with other franchises. And so they don't really want to raise their prices. That won't make sense. They'll lose consumers with that. But they also don't want to cut them because they don't want to lose money. And so they need to figure out some other way to push consumers towards their coffee shop over other coffee shops. And so they do that by differentiating their product and becoming kind of the best in their area. Now, most often we're only going to have monopolistic competition like we do in this Dunkin' Donuts scenario when firms are relatively free to enter and exit the market because there's low barriers to entry. So if a new beverage company wanted to join the market and start selling coffee, there wouldn't be like a ton of barriers to them getting that coffee shop open, right? Like their price of raw materials, not that high. They'll obviously have to rent a space and stuff like that. But in terms of startup costs for an industry, coffee is relatively low, right? So when we're thinking about some of the different characteristics of monopolistic competition, we need many firms. We need to have few barriers to entry. And then we need to have differentiated products, right? So lots of different products, but they need to be differentiated. Everyone in this industry is not going to have a ton of control over price. They have really actually pretty little control over price. The way that they compete is through non-price competition. So those are some of the characteristics of monopolistic competition. So like I said, in a monopolistically competitive market, non-price competition is going to play a huge role, right? So I prefer, maybe I prefer Starbucks, the taste of Starbucks coffee to the taste of Caribou Coffee, or I prefer the experience of going to Beans Coffee versus going to Starbucks, right? That's like non-price competition. And so the couple examples we have listed here are the designer athletic shoes are way more expensive than Sensible sneakers, but you're going to buy them anyway because the image and status associated with that brand is appealing to you. That's a form of non-price competition. Like, why do you buy Nike instead of just like off-brand athletic shoes at Walmart, right? So that would be non-price competition. Likewise, snacks may cost less at a supermarket, but at a gas station, maybe that gas station is a lot closer to your home. So I live in Horace. There's not a grocery store that's like super close. So the closest option, if I just want to run and grab a quick snack, would be Casey's. And so just the location and convenience of that store would be another example of non-price competition for me. So prices, output, and profits under a monopolistically competitive market look very similar to those under a perfectly competitive market structure. Prices under monopolistic competition are a little bit higher, but their demand curves are more elastic because consumers can choose from so many different substitutes. And so if they raise the price too much, they're going to lose too many consumers and actually make less money as a result, because demand is elastic for most of their products. What keeps monopolistically competitive firms from making high profits? So a lot of that has to do with how we set output in a monopolistically competitive firm. As a result of the elasticity of demand in monopolistically competitive firms, the total output is going to fall somewhere between that of a monopoly and that of perfect competition. So generally, monopolistically competitive firms basically earn just enough to cover all of their costs. So they're not going to be making like huge amounts of money necessarily in terms of profit. They can earn profits in the short run, but when there's too many competitors in the market, it can be hard to maintain profits for the long run. So you may start as the only coffee business like in the area, but eventually as people see that that is something that others are desiring and making money off of, you're going to have a lot of competitors join that market. And so eventually you earn less profit because there's so many available substitutes that we divide consumers out amongst. So that's going to result in lower profits than we would tend to see in a monopoly. So then we have an oligopoly. So in an oligopoly, we have a few different firms. We have some variety of goods, but not a ton. So like similar to monopolistic competition where there's some variety through differentiation. But with an oligopoly, the thing that really differentiates it from a monopolistically competitive market would be that it has high barriers to entry, and that's going to result in fewer firms, and that gives them a little bit more control over prices than we see in a monopolistically competitive market. So the two questions on this slide are, why are high barriers to entry an important part of an oligopoly? Because that's going to keep the number of firms in the market at a minimum. And it says, why are there only a few firms in an oligopoly? Then we can go back to there's high barriers to entry, right? That's kind of our cause and effect relationship there. So barriers to entry in an oligopoly can be technological. So you can require a lot of knowledge or a lot of technical knowledge, or they can be created through government actions, just like monopolies can. So you need a patent or you need a license to operate that business. So those would be like the two major reasons that we see oligopolies. And similarly, we see monopolies for those same reasons. So there are really three practices that concern the government regarding oligopolies, and they're things that the government tries to keep an eye on. So one example of an oligopoly would be like the airline industry. There's really not a ton of huge competitors, right? You have like Delta and American Airlines and so on and so forth, but like there's not a ton of competition. And a lot of that has to do with the technological requirements involved in starting up an airline industry. Likewise, the airline industry is heavily regulated, so that's a government action that really does tend to limit the number of firms because there's so much compliance you have to do with government safety standards. But once you're a member of that oligopoly, there's a few things you can do. So there is you know, price leadership, where maybe the biggest company within that oligopoly really sets the standard, and everyone else kind of meets that or tries to compete with them on prices based on the standard that they already set. Collusion is a big concern because it leads to price fixing. And so if these companies are meeting and they're talking about like, hey, we are going to charge the average consumer $400 per plane ticket. And that conversation is not necessarily based off of like costs or anything like that. It's more so about the desire to have a profit and to be competitive with the other few firms within the industry. And so collusion, those conversations can lead to price fixing, and collusion is illegal in the United States. And the airline industry did actually face a collusion lawsuit. So basically there were like more than 100 private lawsuits that were filed in the country where passengers claimed that airlines colluded and talked about what are we going to set our fares at, so on and so forth. This like collusion, they claim, started in around like 2009, led to higher airfare, reduced flight choices, and it just didn't make sense because there were lower fuel prices at the time, and so like why are plane tickets more expensive than others ever before, right? And so passengers claimed that these airlines were colluding and they were price fixing, and it just so happens at the time that this was happening, many of the airlines were posting record profits because their input costs were low at the time. So according to government data, American Airlines, Delta, Southwest, and United together controlled roughly 70% of US domestic air travel from October of 16 to September of 17 when this actual lawsuit was taking place. So they really like ran the show, and they were found guilty and faced some fines as a result of these lawsuits. Cartels also are concerning to the government because cartels are literally just set up to coordinate prices and production, and that allows them to set quotas, so to set the level of supply at a certain amount, which really does allow them to have control over price. And so not a huge fan of that either, and that would be in violation of some antitrust laws as well, which we will talk about in the next section. So this is just an example of OPEC. OPEC is an organization of petroleum exporting countries, and it's really an international cartel of the major oil producers. OPEC members produce about 40% of the world's oil, but they control 75% of the world's oil reserves. And members are meeting regularly to set production quotas. So most experts agree that the world oil supplies are not sufficient to meet current demand. And in 2008, the head of the OPEC delegation made a prediction that just due to this cartel, more or less, like the days of easy, cheap oil are over because all of our producers have really organized themselves, and they can affect world oil prices and increase them, really, is what's the more likely scenario. All right, so that was kind of a lengthy one. Let me know if you guys have questions, but those are our last two market structures. So monopolistic competition and oligopolies. We got one section left. Reach out if you have questions. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day.